From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet development and website marketing for an affordable price. And by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and Garage Makeovers, the number one garage remodeling company in South Florida. Let's go ahead and get to it. This is another mailbag. I've been doing a lot of these lately because there have just been so many questions coming in, and questions that really just kind of theme what I wanted to talk about anyway. So this provides some nice structure to the show. So these first questions brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville. As I've said before, Luis will stage your house. He's the best in the business at walkthrough videos, drone footage of your property, all sorts of different things. Let him know if you need to list anything in the greater Jacksonville area. Let him know you heard about him from Unconquered with Doc Staples. Okay. So next thing is we're going to go ahead and start with these mailbag questions. So first question. This is a little extended one, but I'm going to put this together with another one as well that came in very similar. So it goes this way. My frustration with the DJ versus Brock situation is this. Mike will go for 2-point conversions, questionable fourth downs, etc. And really, for the most part, I love that, playing to win. But he'll keep trotting out the big fella, playing not to lose. I'm as big a fan of Norvell as you'll find. He's losing a ton of goodwill that he rightly earned. I can appreciate not bowing to the whims of fans. You don't want that. But sooner or later, he must give Brock or Luke a look. Do you really think he's trying not to lose to keep bowl hopes alive, playing the long game to get those extra couple weeks of practice to separate Brock from Luke or vice versa? That's the only thing that makes sense to me. And then I get another question that's really similar that I'm going to just put with that. Do you think the reason the DJU continues to start with his poor performance is due to NIL? He has to play in so many games, perhaps. Whew, okay. So first and foremost, no, I don't think it has anything to do with NIL. Really, it does have everything to do with what they've seen and what they continue to see in practice. And yes, we are talking about practice, man. Practice. Not the game that they go out there and they kill themselves for. We talking about practice, man. Practice. What are we talking about? Practice? We talk about practice. And it's not silly to talk about practice, because when you're talking about the quarterback position, when you're talking about anything in terms of playing these young guys, the only way that you know what you have, the only data that you have to go on in terms of what they're capable of doing and all of that is what they've shown in practice. So if you can't trust a guy not to throw interceptions, if you can't trust a guy to do some of the things that the guy you're playing isn't doing well any better, he hasn't given you any reason to play him over the older guy. And as a former coach, I can tell you that carries a lot of weight with a coach. And it's really, really, really hard as a coach to play a guy over another guy who has continually outperformed him day after day in practice, just because something's happened and the older guy is, or the guy who's been better every day in practice isn't getting it done in games. It's really hard if the guy who's not getting it done in games and has been better in practice, it's really hard to go to the guy that's been even worse in practice and go, all right, we got to give you a shot to see if maybe you're better in games than the guy that you've not been better than in practice. It's just hard to do that, first of all. Now, as far as do I think he's trying not to lose to keep bowl hopes alive? Guys, these coaches try to win every game that they're playing. Yeah, they want to play the long game. They want to develop young players for the future. They want to do all that. But this is not a situation like the NFL where some teams are just going to trade away all the pieces and then, essentially teams get to the place where they're tanking and all of that. And they're supposed to still play to win the game and all that. But we all know that kind of the NFL level, that doesn't happen all the time. These coaches are trying to win every week. Yes, they've got 3 losses. They're 1-3. The season is shot in terms of what their hopes were for the season coming in. But I'm telling you, they're trying to win every game. Not just not to lose, to keep bowl hopes alive. They're trying to win out. That's what they want to do. And they're playing DJU because they believe that he gives them the best shot to win at this point. And I know, given what we've seen from DJU so far, it's hard to imagine that he's the best thing that they've got in terms of that. But that's what they think. And again, it's based on what they see in practice, because Brock Glenn has not been better. And Luke has not been better than Brock Glenn. Remember, Luke Kromenhoek played 2 years of quarterback in high school, came in with significant things to deal with in terms of his release and polish, learning how to play the position, getting more accurate, all those things. Everybody knew when he came in that he was going to need at least a year, if not more than that, to develop and become the quarterback that he could be. You're talking about a guy that was brought in because of his ceiling, not because of his floor, not because he was an early playtime candidate. Right? That's why they went out and they got a bridge quarterback, because they didn't feel like either of these guys was fully ready to contend, and certainly not Luke. Now, Brock was going to be a real question on that, and, if he developed, maybe he would contend for it, and he did compete for the job, but ultimately he lost out on the job because he's not been as consistent. He's not been as good in practice. And again, it's hard to believe that. If you look at the numbers, or if you just, if you have eyes and you watch what's happened with DJU, guys, it's been terrible. And, there are some things, you can look at the number of drops that they've had. There've been a lot of drops on him, and it's been, wide receivers, mostly actually tight ends and running backs that have had those drops. But something else to think about is even the on-frame throws that DJ has thrown that have gotten dropped. Some of those, one of the issues is that DJ often has thrown a very difficult to catch ball. So a ball that's not spiraling, a ball that's kind of wobbling and knuckling at you, is a much harder football to catch, especially when it's thrown at fairly high velocity and knuckling at you. It's a much harder ball to catch than a ball that's just spun with a nice, pretty spiral, and that just spins into your gloves and stops. I'm telling you, as somebody who's caught both types of balls, you're just going to drop a much higher percentage of balls that are not spun well. It's just the truth. You hear people talk about, the difference between catching a lefty versus a right-hander. I never really noticed much of a difference with a lefty versus a right-hander. Yeah, it spins the opposite way when it hits your gloves and all that, but that didn't really bother me. But balls that kind of come in from all sorts of angles and all that, those get tough. That gets tough to catch. So even the drops with him are somewhat, they're not entirely unrelated to him, and he's been an extremely inaccurate thrower, even on the stuff that is the throws that you brought him in for. And the bigger thing for me is that he's not done a great job of making sure that they're in the right run play, or that he's getting the ball out to the right spot if they're, if they've stacked the box on certain things. A number of those things he's not been great at either. And that's the reason why I agree that actually, if I were Mike Norvell, I would be looking at having a couple packages for Brock Glenn and giving him a series or two against SMU. Just because he hasn't been as good, but you've got to start potentially looking at other options just because of how bad DJU has been in games. And if, you keep firing blanks in games, at some point, I think you do kind of have to double check. You have to look at what your other options are. But like I said, it's hard as a coach to do that. It just is. Okay, moving on now to the next set of questions here. The next question is, why do the FSU defensive ends lose contain so much? The play starts inside and then it gets bounced outside. Is it because FSU does not trust its linebackers? Okay, this is actually an important point. So it's widely assumed by fans that defensive ends just have constant contain responsibility. So why is it that they're losing containment? Well, it really depends on the play that you're going against and the technique that the defense calls for on the play. Florida State tends to be a spill team against counter, against split zone, against anything that's going to have some sort of kick out against the edge player. What that means is you've got essentially two different options. So imagine you have a counter, and we've seen lots of that for Florida State and from Florida State's opponents. What that's going to mean is you're going to get two pullers from one side of the ball to the other side of the ball. One of those pullers, it's going to be the first puller on counter, usually a guard, is going to be responsible for the kick out block normally. That's the way that the play is designed, to have a kick out block on the end man on the line of scrimmage. So the offensive tackle is going to block down on the defensive tackle. That's going to bring that edge player, he's going to step down with that offensive tackle to kind of close that gap. And then when the guard comes across the formation, he's going to block that defensive end. He's trying to kick him out, to seal him to the outside, so that then the second puller comes up as a lead blocker in front of the back or the quarterback, whoever's running it, and then you're leading him into the hole. That's the default way to play that. Now, what most defenses do, in most modern defenses do, is they try to avoid, they do not allow that guard to get a kick out block against that edge. Instead, what the edge tries to do is to spill the play. So the edge tries to do what's called wrong shoulder the guard or whoever is on the kick out block. And this is the same thing with a split zone where you have an H-back coming across the formation to kick out the end man on the line of scrimmage. In that, you wrong shoulder it, which means instead of hitting it with your outside shoulder to keep contain, you use your inside shoulder, or instead of keeping your outside shoulder free to keep contain, you come to the inside of the blocker, you hit the inside of half of the blocker, and you hit him with your outside shoulder instead of your inside shoulder, and you try to blow that up and force the second puller on counter, or if it's split zone, just in general, try to get inside. You're trying to get inside that blocker to force a way to keep him from being able to kick you out and keep you on the outside, so that you shut down that inside running seam and you force the back to bounce. So you do what's called spilling the ball carrier. The ball carrier has that inside track. Now he can't take that inside track because you caused that log jam there. And now that back has to bounce the ball to the outside. So you've spilled it. And the whole objective of this is basically to force the ball carrier to run east-west and let the defense recover and run to the football, rather than giving him an inside track where he can run north-south. Because north-south gains yardage. East-west gives your defense a chance. So what Florida State does is they tend to spill rather than box. Now, boxing is where you play that and you play it square and you keep your outside shoulder clean, and you do take on that kick out block and you try to blow it up as much as possible, but you are the contain guy and you're trying to keep that bottled up as much as possible. You try to compress that space, but the space just gets closed down and the back is going to work on that inside track. So he's going to get north-south, but the way that this works is if you are a box team where you are boxing that with your edge, the edge tries to compress it as much as possible while preventing it from bouncing. And then you're going to have a linebacker generally that's going to try to work downhill into that vertical space. And he's going to be responsible for closing down the hole that is going to be there between the kick out and the offensive line that's blocking down. That's the way that works. Now, if you spill it, what you're trying to do is, instead of the backer filling the hole and taking on the vertical path of the running back, the defensive end actually has that hole, and the linebacker is actually working outside where the defensive end is. He scrapes down the line of scrimmage, and then he has the responsibility of taking on that outside space, along with a safety who's running the alley. And so you essentially get those players that run the alley, that work their way over the top and run the alley to take care of anything that bounces. And then if they block that safety, then the corner has an exchange with the safety. The corner in quarters, teams are going to block if you've got a cover 4 type coverage family or cover 7, which is Florida State's default, teams will try to block that safety because he's the secondary support there that's going to run the alley to take care of the bounce. And then the corner, then when that safety gets blocked, as the guy's coming into the safety, the corner has to exchange, and then he becomes the secondary support player and has to make the tackle on the edge. That's all hard to visualize, I'm sure, without video. I can talk about this, or I will talk about this on the belated evaluation of this week's film, but that's the basics of what Florida State normally does. Florida State, like most modern aggressive defenses, it plays more spill against these kinds of inside runs than they do box. And so when you spill, the key thing is that those guys who are responsible for handling the bounce have to be there. That means your linebackers have to stay clean and have to scrape, and your safeties and corners have to do a great job in run support. Safeties run in the alley, and then corners, if they're able to get a block on the safety, have to switch off. So that's why the defensive ends lose contain so much. If the play gets bounced outside, it means the defensive end generally did his job. But the problem that we saw this week, and we've seen before from Florida State, is that they all too often have bounced. They've managed to spill the play, but they're spilling the play to nobody because the safety's not there in time, and no backer has managed to scrape over top without getting blocked. So that's been a problem. But if that happens, that's on the second level, not on the defensive end. All right. Next question. Why does Kyle Morlock continue to play so much when he does not block well or catch the football consistently? That's a great question. And I think the main reason is that Morlock has he's actually been better than the other options, and the guys that have a chance to be a lot better than him are freshmen. If we keep seeing what we've been seeing, you're going to start seeing those freshmen take over a little bit. But, tight end tends to be, as I said in the season previews, it's one of those positions where it's one of the hardest positions to play early because you've got the problems of wide receiver in terms of the things that make wide receiver such a difficult position to play early. Plus you have all the blocking stuff. So it's a position where usually freshmen just don't do a whole lot. Sophomores can, second year guys can often do a lot, but they have Morlock and then a couple guys that just aren't better than him. And then the freshmen who have a chance to be a lot better than him that are still learning position. Pretty simple. And that related question, what position do you see Amari Williams playing when he gains enough weight? Defensive end or tight end? What position would he be best at on this team? So frankly, my position on that is I would prefer Amari Williams to be at defensive end because I think it's one of the very best, one of the very most important positions in modern football. You have to be really good with really good athletes on the edge. Tight end is a great position, and if you've got a guy that can change the scoreboard there, like a Brock Bowers, then okay, well, that guy needs to play tight end. But unless Amari Williams is Brock Bowers, I think his athleticism probably winds up being best at defensive end if he's able to gain the weight. The real question is whether or not he's able to gain sufficient weight to be able to play defensive end at the high level that I think he could with that weight. That's the question. If he's not able to gain quite enough weight, then you keep him at tight end and he becomes more of a receiving option at tight end. Okay, this next set of questions is brought to you by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Look, if you want a boutique experience, if you want someone who understands how difficult it can be to get to buy a new house, especially if you're a first-time home buyer, give Justin a call. You will be very grateful you did. Compare between different options. That's one of the beauties of the way that this all works. Take a look at different options in terms of your mortgage loan options. But I'm telling you, you're not going to find better than Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage. If you need to buy a house or any other real estate in Tennessee or Kentucky or in Florida, give Justin Galloway a call. Let him know you heard about him from Unconquered with Doc Staples. Okay. So the next question is really, really interesting, and I think pretty insightful, and I did some digging for this. So did some research and saw that excluding the North Alabama and Southern Miss games from last year, the Virginia Tech game was the only game last season where Florida State's offense ran for 200 yards. And you have otherwise to go back to the UF game in 2022 for the last time they did so against a Power 5 or Power 4 team. Does Mike Norvell need to change his approach to running the football? Boy, that's a great question. And frankly, the numbers are worse than you think. Buckle your safety belts, everybody, because we're going to take a look at some ugly numbers here. So I went through and I took a look at the numbers from 2021 through 2024. So the last 3 full seasons plus this season, limited to major conference opposition. So Power 5 or Power 3 competition. All right. So these are the numbers with Jordan Travis on the field, running the football. These are the numbers. 4.8 yards per carry, 2.25 yards before contact per rush, 3.36 yards after contact per rush, a tackle for loss for run plays, tackles for loss on run plays of 19.3%, and an EPA, so expected points per rush on designed run plays of positive 0.02. So 0.02 points for every rushing play. Okay? That's with Jordan Travis. Without Jordan Travis on the field, these are the numbers against Power 5 to Power 3 competition over the last 3+ years. 3.4 yards per carry, 1.24 yards per rush before contact, 3.03 yards after contact per rush, a tackle for loss per run play rate of 27.67%, and a designed rushing EPA per rush of minus 0.06. Okay, so I know that this is a hard format to really get those kind of comparisons across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read them together then. So with Jordan Travis, yards per carry, 4.8. Without, 3.4. So that's a 30% decrease in yards per carry without Jordan Travis. Yards per contact, or yards after contact per rush, almost the same, 3.36, 3.03. The real difference, the primary difference, comes in yards before contact per rush. With Jordan Travis on the field, Florida State averaged 2.25 yards before contact per rush. Without Jordan Travis, that number is 1.24. So on a percentage basis, Florida State, over the last 3.5 seasons, has averaged 45% less per carry before contact than they did with Jordan Travis on the field. That's almost half the yards per contact that they got with Jordan Travis on the field. Part of that is because of this. Tackle for loss percentage on run plays goes from 19.3% to 27.67%. So you're getting over a quarter of run plays tackled for loss when Jordan Travis has not been on the field, versus just under 20%. Still not great, just under 1 in 5, but more than 1 in 4 goes to a little bit less than 1 in 5. It's a big difference. And then the EPA per rush is a difference of 0.08 per rush. So 0.08, 8/100ths of a point per rush difference with Jordan Travis not on the field, uncalled run plays. So those are some ugly numbers. And so this brings us back to the original question. Does Norvell need to change his approach to running the ball? So the interesting thing is that before Norvell was hired, and I've talked about this on this show, one of the things that a defensive coordinator who had coached against Norvell told me before this, and I said it on this show before he was hired, they should hire Mike Norvell at Florida State. One thing he's always going to be able to do, that guy is going to be able to run the football. He's got a really creative running game, really creative at finding ways to manufacture yards in the running game. And that's going to be what they need down there, and that'll help them compete with Clemson, because Venables at the time was at Clemson, and that's really important, being able to manufacture different ways to run the ball. So that's really interesting, because right now, over this time period, that's been a bit of an issue, running the football. Right? I mean, you start looking at these numbers, these are not great numbers. And when you take Jordan Travis off the field, they're awful numbers. You go from being a good rush offense to being a well below average rush offense. So one other thing that I did is I went and I pulled some numbers again, and based on what I had sitting in front of me. And I was curious about how Mike Norvell has called the run game at Florida State the last few years compared to how he called the run game at Memphis before taking over at Florida State. So a couple things were interesting. Number one is, as we all know, Florida State's primary run play since Norvell has been at Florida State has been the counter play. They've hung their hat on that play. Since Norvell's arrival, FSU has run counter a little over 28% of the time on called run plays. That's a lot. That's really counter heavy. And then inside zone has been the next most used play in terms of the run game at just under 15%. Now, the interesting thing for me is when you look back at Norvell's time at Memphis, and I remembered going back through this in the past and taking a look at what he had done, going through some film and what he had done at Memphis. And the base run play that they ran the most at Memphis was not counter. It was inside zone. At Memphis, inside zone was almost a quarter of the run game instead of counter. Counter was actually about an eighth of the running game at Memphis. So those have basically reversed since Norvell's been at Florida State. Florida State became a very heavy counter team and didn't do nearly as much inside zone. So my take on this is, yes, I do think Norvell actually, it would benefit Norvell to change his more recent approach to running the football and go back to his roots, go back to his past and become a little bit more zone dominant, a little bit more inside zone, especially than counter dominant. They've run counter pretty poorly this year. And I think moving back towards an inside zone, outside zone, down, outside zone G type play would be advantageous. Now, I say that despite the fact that when you look at the numbers, Florida State's yards before contact per rush since Norvell has arrived at Florida State, and that's become his primary play, it's been by a healthy margin, by more than a quarter, more than 25%. It's been the best of the run plays that Florida State has run. So since Norvell arrived in 2020, EPA per rush on counter is 0.13 versus inside zone where it's 0.05. Those are per Pro Football Focus. So, it's hard to go away from something that has been so good for you. But, looking at the 2024 season specifically, that's not held up. Inside zone has been by far a better play compared to counter, and has been really one of the only plays that's actually been decent for you in the running game. So I do think that that's something that they need to go to a little bit more at this stage. And frankly, they have the last few games. Inside zone has been the play that now through 4 games, they've run more than any other in 2024. So they're becoming more inside zone heavy as this season has gone, which shows you some adjustment as Norvell has adjusted to what his team has done okay and what they've not done as well. So he's already adjusting. The other problem, though, here, and this gets to some of the stuff with Jordan Travis. So if you look at why is it that with Jordan Travis on the field, they were so much better running the football? Well, one of those reasons is obviously because Jordan Travis was a really, really effective runner from the quarterback spot. And so teams had to spend some energy trying to make sure that he wasn't going to cut them up as a runner. So that gains you a gap and all of that in terms of the read option game and all those things. So you're committing some additional attention to the quarterback there. That's a factor. The other factor, though, is, and this is the underrated factor about Jordan Travis, and this is something that I talked about a little bit last year, and even I, in the transition, I talked about how this is the thing that couldn't be really easily replaced from Jordan Travis, and that is what he meant for you as a decision maker, as a leader, all of that he did so incredibly well. And I talked about, you're getting a guy who's been through a lot of football with DJU and all that, and you hope that he can kind of get you where you need to go in terms of at least the decision-making on the field, although there's no way you're going to replace the leadership. Well, the thing is, if you look at this year, the decision-making in terms of when to hand the ball off, when to toss the ball out on the RPO screen or the RPO, downfield option, whether that's a glance or a quick hitch, whether that's, when to pull the ball and run, all of those decisions are really, really important for making sure that the running game runs smoothly. Because if teams can commit to the run and then get tackles for loss because you're handing it off when you shouldn't be, or you're taking it and pitching it outside when you should have handed it off, or you're not pulling the ball smoothly and quickly when they do collapse the edge so the edge guy can play the running back and you at the same time, those are things that dramatically impact the running game that are not really about the quarterback's capacity to run athletically. It's about the decision-making part. And that's something that DJU has done very poorly. And that's something that Jordan Travis, especially 2022, 23, and 24, by the time he started, by the second half of 2022, he got it. He understood what they were doing, and he consistently got them in the right look, made the right swap, flipped the play to here, got the ball out on the edge when it needed to be, handled the football really well. His ball handling was excellent. All of those things, those are the little things that quarterbacks do in the pre-snap and just in terms of basic ball handling and fundamentals that really make a difference for an offense. They make this is why it's not just about completing the passes. It's not about, running and presenting a run threat with your own legs and all that. This is why coaches grade quarterbacks not just on that stuff, but on whether or not the offense moves with a quarterback. Because a lot of times the offense moves more smoothly because the quarterback does such a great job on this stuff. And Travis was borderline genius on this stuff. He did great. He was consistently right. And they've been wrong a lot on this stuff this year. So the things that really need to change here, as much as anything, is just making sure that they're making the right pre-snap decisions, that they're not running into the wrong looks and all of that. And some of that's just flat out on the quarterback. Some of it also is, can you persuade the defense not to come downhill with the safeties every play? Because if you can hit them in the teeth with a big play down the field, they're going to be less likely to do that. So that's the other aspect to this as well. Travis started hitting downfield bucket throws, the posts and the goes and those sorts of things, back shoulders. He started hitting high EPA, high points per play type plays, and teams started to have to back off. So All of that went into that. Without that threat, when you don't have a quarterback that's presenting all of that for you, it can get ugly really quickly, and it has. So it's not really just about approach to running the ball, though I do think he needs to some degree and has already started to do that to some degree. It's about the rest of that and whether or not they can get the quarterback to start making some of those plays. That's the real question. All right, final segment here brought to you by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. If you want a garage that's going to make your house and your garage the envy of your neighborhood, give Nathan a call, have him come out to you, serving Broward and Palm Beach counties. They're the best in the business down there. They'll make sure that your garage is extremely well organized. They do the whole flooring thing, the polyaspartic, coating and all of that stuff. Make sure, I mean, you can make it into a garage man cave with them. Give them a holler. Let them know you heard about them from the Unconquered podcast with Doc Staples. All right, final question here. Saw the depth chart this week, and they moved Earl Little Jr. to safety. Do you think he's a better fit there? Well, to be honest, Earl Little Jr. has just sucked so badly so far that they're just trying to figure out if he can be good anywhere. Because he's been awful. How awful, you ask? Well, the numbers don't lie. When Earl Little Jr. has not been on the field, Florida State's success rate defensively is 55.1%, and they've given up 4.67 yards per play and 8 touchdowns. It's not great, but not abysmal. But I can tell you this, when Earl Little has been on the field, or whenever there's been a big play, I'll just say, or close to a big play, I've started looking for number 0. Why? Well, because odds are he's been on the field. And I went and I dug it out. I looked through things and did my, crunch the numbers. And when he has been on the field, Florida State's defensive success rate goes from 55% to 31%. With Earl Little on the field, Florida State's defense has given up 11.66 yards per play. 11.66 yards per play. Again, without Earl Little on the field, they've given up 4.67 yards per play. With him on the field, they have given up they're giving up more than a first down per play with Earl Little on the field. They have given up more first downs with him on the field than they have prevented first downs with him on the field. Guys, that's crazy. That is crazy. That's why he's moved to safety. Because finally, we got to see Edwin Joseph come in and get those backup reps in this last game. And you know what? The fact that Edwin Joseph got Earl Little's backup reps at the nickel position behind Knowles, and that he was the primary dime player instead of Little, that alone might have been the reason that Florida State beat Memphis. I'm serious. It's that bad that when Little has been on the field, the defensive performance has been so poor because he keeps missing assignments. He's been a bad tackler. He's taken terrible angles, all of that. And look, you guys know me. I don't tend to throw guys under the bus like this, but this has been so egregious. I've just wondered what's going on. And the numbers don't lie. When Earl Little was replaced by Edwin Joseph in the dime role and then as a backup nickel, the defense went from giving up 11.66 yards per play to 4.83 yards per play with Edwin Joseph on the field. And then when neither are on the field, that's 4.80 yards per play. So when Edwin Joseph is on the field, it's basically the same defense as, when Knowles or anybody else is out there. at the nickel spot, and when he's out there at dime, they're good defense. When Little has been out there in either of those roles, it's been terrible. Now, the question is, can Little suddenly, by moving back to safety, find a home and really be a good contributor? That I don't know. But I can tell you right now, he can't play at the star position or at the nickel position like I thought he would before the season. And, I had my concerns that I stated before the season based on some practice stuff, but it got way worse than I ever imagined. And so, you all can remember him being like 10 yards behind Singleton from Georgia Tech in what should have been an easy touchdown there too. So, that number of 11 plus yards per play could have been even worse. Should be. If, you get a quarterback that locates an easy throw. So that's why he moved. And quite frankly, I'm not sure whether or not he's going to be on the field anytime soon at safety, because, there's going to be a learning curve there and all that, but they've not been great at safety either. So the hope is that he suddenly finds a home there at safety and becomes a reliable option there and can kind of turn it around. But yeah, Edwin Joseph is a good player, and he's made room for himself to take some of those reps. And that defense is going to be a lot better by him being out there in that reserve role and also as a starting dime player when they go to dime. Because he brings energy, he brings the effort, he's consistently in the right place. He does a lot of those things right. And when you got a guy at that spot that plays with that kind of burst and speed and all of that and does things right and arrives angry, play him more. So that's why. All right, it is. And boy, I tell you what, this is probably the first time in this show's history that I've, during a season, gone that far into one guy being a significant problem like that. But again, the numbers are so stark when you go from 55% defensive success rate to a 31% success rate with 11 yards per play. Well, almost 12 yards, 11.66 yards per play. That's why. And again, these guys now are professionals, so it is a little bit different than in the past. I was much more hesitant to go that level in the past, but yeah, that's a lot. Actually, you know what? I think I got time for one more question. I'm going to go ahead and hit this one before we go, and that is going to be a question about coaches. So this is a long question, so I'm going to go ahead and do and read this. I'll kind of edit on the fly as it's read. So here's the question. My question is, all this talk of whether our current coaches are recruiting type coaches or more coaching XO types, rather than fire the non-recruiting ones, shouldn't we fire the poor X's and O's ones? I guess I don't get why the recruiting prowess is so prized, especially in this day of NIL, where I assume that is the main driver of where a kid goes. Not this hallowed relationship that people like, and then you've got some references to some people, others that cover Florida State who are friends, so I'm just going to leave that out. Further, I would think before I fire a coach, it would be easier to instruct him to pick up the relationship game. I know a person can't suddenly develop a sparkling and witty, fun personality, but one should be able to simply spend more time with the kid, getting to know him, etc. Let's say Randy Shannon spends 3 hours a week on pure recruiting. I tell him to start a log and I want him to spend 10 hours a week. That is a direct order. Otherwise, he's let go. However, if he's a poor X's and O's coach, which is what it looks like, as his linebackers appear clueless at times, then I fire for that. From what I hear, Atkins is a good recruiter, but his lines aren't playing well, so I fire him for that. But I hire the best coaches and tell them it's expected to up their time on recruiting. So then, others have said that Norvell is okay as a recruiter, but isn't as fully bought into it as, say, Saban, Smart, and Cristobal are. To me, then, he sets a tone with his staff. So to me, Norvell not only has to demand that his coaches recruit a lot more in off hours, but he himself has to lead by example. He has to make the time to establish the relationships, which we don't have otherwise. We wouldn't keep losing high-end talent on signing day, but to just fire coaches because they don't recruit well seems premature. First, demand that it is number one. Find the time, get better. If they don't, then fire them. But we can't afford to just pay them off and hire recruiters who don't coach well. Come on, Mike, set the tone and the expectations. Boy, that's a great question. Okay. So there's a few layers here. First of all, the current structure now has changed a lot of this, because analysts can now function as full on-field coaches in practice and games. The guys who are actually the official coaches on your staff of 10 assistant coaches, the difference between them and anybody else who's on your support staff is not that they're coaching now. It's that they're allowed to recruit off campus. That is the distinction between a full-blown coach and an analyst or quality control specialist or any other number of titles that you might have on your support staff. That means that the best coaches, the best X's and O guys, can be stashed as high-paid analysts now, and they can do their best work, and they can work with your players. They can run drills. They can do all sorts of stuff. But you have got to have guys who are great at getting talent onto campus in the jobs that are allowed to recruit off campus. And the problem is that some guys are actually just a lot better at that than others. And it's not just about time investment. Some of it is personality. Some of it is magnetism. And some guys are just painfully awkward and they're off-putting, and guys just don't want to play for those guys. And I'm telling you, Florida State's got at least one of those guys on their staff in a key spot. And if players and families don't want to just go play for that guy, then you're going to have to pay extra in NIL to potentially attract them. And they still probably aren't going to want to do it, because once you get to a certain point of NIL, that's not the dividing factor. Okay, so you're going to get $250,000 a year from this place or $300,000 a year from this place, but you really like the guy that you're going to be playing for $250,000. Which one are you going to take? You're going to feel that much more day to day than you will the extra $50,000. It's just how those decisions are made once you get above a threshold. And that's one of the things that has to be considered here. NIL, for a lot of these collectives and so on, needs to be considered on a threshold basis. How much is really going to be necessary for somebody else to take somebody from us? What are we going to need to pay this guy to get him here or retain him here rather than him going somewhere else? And coaches that players want to be around and want to play for are actually, they save you money because you don't have to pay the players as much. It works that way in the NFL too, for what it's worth. Now, I do think Norvell needs to push harder as a recruiter himself, but more than that, he has to require more from his coaches as recruiters. Some of these guys on staff are not ever going to be player magnets, but all of these guys on staff need to recruit harder and work harder. Now, I'll say a couple of these guys are much better at that than others. I mean, I think Ron Dugans does a lot of the work here, a lot more than people realize. But you've got to have guys that get players who want to play for less because they want to play for that guy. And you mentioned, from what you hear, Atkins is a good recruiter. I don't know where you've heard that, frankly. Atkins is one of the worst guys on the staff in terms of actually putting in the work and developing relationships with kids. Because it's just, look, it's demeaning for grown men to have to do what they have to do with high school boys to try to get them to come and play for you. And some guys just aren't really into putting in that work. And I'm telling you, there are several coaches on Florida State staff that just don't put in that work. They're not reaching out to these guys, even on necessarily a weekly basis, to touch base and say, hey, just checking in. Hope you're doing well. Anything you want from me. I know you got a big game coming up this Friday against your rival. Going to be looking forward to seeing how you do. How you've been doing in algebra. Any number of things. Or hey, have you heard the latest, Lamar song? Whatever. Any number of things that you can do to try to touch base with these guys. You got to do it. You got to text them. All of that is part of the game. And to me, if your coaches are not willing to put in the extra work to do that, then yeah, you fire them for that. And I do think the one thing I absolutely agree with you on in terms of this question and some of your statements on that is this does have to come back to Norvell in terms of putting on the pressure to say, look, if you don't do this, and if I can't see evidence that this has changed, you're gone. because we've got to get players, and we've got to get players from high school. We've got to do better in terms of attracting players once they get in from the portal. But, you have certain guys on this coaching staff who, it is true, few of these guys on this coaching staff would rather spend the time recruiting the portal because it's a few weeks of work rather than a couple years of relationship building to get a guy out of high school. And I get that, and the other thing is that out of the portal, you have a little bit more knowledge a lot of times of what that guy's going to be. But the fact of the matter is the portal's getting much more expensive. And with the top level guys, those guys are going to start getting locked down on those rosters. You'd better start being able to get some of those guys from high school. And if you don't put that attention in, it's going to be a problem. So to me, if I'm Mike Norvell, I'm very seriously evaluating this entire coaching staff the remainder of the year. And one of the things I'm evaluating them on is how much time they're putting in recruiting and whether or not they're developing the relationships necessary to land the players that, first of all, they've not been able to land to date. There have been a couple key decommitments and all of that. And why have those guys decommitted? I mean, take a look at who they're going to be playing for. And to me, you don't go out and win those guys back, your job's on the line. Straightforward. And, I think FSU boosters is going to have to be willing to, and FSU in general is going to have to be willing to eat some contracts probably after this year. But the fact of the matter is, unless you are a top 5 or top 10 X's and O's guy, and you're actually at a coordinator position where it really, really matters, then you dang well better be able to recruit. Unless you're a top 5, top 10 developer, if you can't recruit, you're not going to be able to coach your way out of a talent deficit. And I do believe, look, NIL it gets you to the table. You have to offer enough to be competitive, but relationships are what close the deal more often than not. That's not always true. You get your situations like Jeremiah Smith, where top bidder's probably going to get him. Although Jeremiah Smith was going to go to Ohio State, I think even if Miami had outbid Ohio State, because he wanted to play for that position coach. He wanted to play there. He believes in what they've been doing in terms of guys going to the NFL, regardless of whether that's actually a position coach issue or just that they keep landing those guys. That, it feeds itself. Once you start getting guys that keep going to the NFL and you can point to those guys as developed, then there you go. But, a guy like Bolden, for example, he was bought, right? The offer was so much more than what Florida State was offering that changed that. But for the most part, all you really need to do is be in the field of play in terms of NIL. And even if you're a little bit lower than what everybody else is offering, it's the relationships that'll close the deal. And Florida State's got to get guys in those roles that are going to be willing to put in the work to build the relationships and also are going to be capable of building those relationships moving forward. There's no question about that. And look, I'm just calling him the way I see him at this point. I know some folks will look at this as being a little bit negative. I've called out more than one person by name on this podcast of late, which is uncommon for me. But, at a certain point, there's no use, not naming names and talking about how this is actually working. So, all right, well, that'll do it for us. This was a long one. We'll go ahead and wrap here. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening and thanks for your support. I made this.